The time it's hard for us to pray because we feel like the person who we are praying to is at the center of our problems. Because honestly, there are things that he can do with a slap of his fingers that will resolve majority of our problems, but it's like he's not doing it. So like, why am I praying? Why am I worshiping? Like, what is all of this? Like, what's the point really of all of this, right? You know how sometimes as believers, we have these phases in our walk with God where one day we are very fervent and we are praying so powerfully. We are consistent with our Bible studies, like we are worshiping Him on a daily basis, like we are in love with Him. Everything is well, our hearts is at peace, our minds are clear and free of all manners of like thoughts and distractions, and it's just beautiful, right? It's pure and wholesome. But then it gets to a point where we begin to retreat from him for a couple of days, weeks, months. Like, I'm pretty sure we have all found ourselves saying things like, I haven't even prayed as I used to for the past couple of days. Like, I haven't even worshipped. I haven't even studied scripture as I used to for the past couple of days because of X, Y, and Z, right? And oftentimes, these things stems from our hearts, like this disconnect that we have with God. It stems from issues within our hearts that we have left unresolved, right? And then eventually this issue begins to bear such a deep root in our hearts that we can't even ignore, and now is really causing some sort of affliction between us, affliction within our hearts, but it's also us causing us to be distant with God, or it's causing our heart towards Him, our love towards Him to become cold, right? And I really want us to talk about that kind of phenomenon that we have, where we have this on and off relationship with God. One day we are zealous, one day we are not. One day we are in love, one day we are not, right? And I remember I'm reminded of, like, in the Old Testament we see the priesthood. And these priests, their job is to remain in God's presence and serve within the tabernacle throughout the day, right? And that's all they were called to do. And there have been times where it's like they will I don't even know how to explain it. Like, they observe things that any normal person, or not, I wouldn't say normal person, but like the average person would not want to draw nearer to God after that. So, for example, there was a time where um, Aaron, his sons, ended up offering the wrong incense. And when they did that, the Lord struck them down and they both died right in front of him. And immediately God instructed Moses to tell Aaron that he should not cry, he should not mourn the death of his sons. In fact, he should not even leave his presence. He should not leave the tabernacle, or else he will die, right? And you read this account and you're just like, that is a bit harsh. Like, oh my God. Like, like, imagine you just lost your sons just like that. And now you're commanded to even stay there, not mourn, and continue service as usual, right? Seems a bit harsh. But then in the light of the New Testament, Paul reveals that we are also a royal priesthood, right? And because we are a member of a royal priesthood, we also have a responsibility to stand before God day and night. Even there's a verse where Paul also said that we should present our bodies a living sacrifice in Roman daily before God, holy and acceptable in His sight, right? So regardless of how you are feeling that day, maybe you're not in the mood, you're not really feeling Him that day because maybe you are reminded of an unanswered prayer, you are reminded of a certain affliction, or the things that you are trusting him for seems to be getting worse, and now they have occupied your mind and your heart. Now you don't want to come before him, but if you are a royal priest, you have to. There's not, you don't push your emotions above being in the presence of God and raising up incense of worship, of praise, of thanksgiving. Like, that does not come, nothing should come in the way of that, right? Just as how we saw in the Old Testament, like nothing should come in the way of like their worship, even if they felt as though God was at fault, right? And oftentimes it's hard for us to pray because we feel like the person who we are praying to is at the center of our problems. Because honestly, there are things that he can do with a slap of his fingers that will resolve majority of our problems, but it's like he's not doing it. So like, why am I praying? Why am I worshiping? Like, what is all of this? Like, what's the point really of all of this, right? And one thing that I've been learning about the priesthood is that they live a life of absolute obedience and submission to God, right? And if we profess that we are a royal priesthood, then that should also be our mindset, like to live a life of absolute obedience and submission to God above all else, right? And in order for us to get to that place, we really had to resolve a lot of the issues of our hearts. Like I mentioned before, the things that draws us away from God for a time and a half is because of a pain, a discouragement, and anxiety, like something that is stemming from our hearts that is pulling us away from him, right? And we really need to take note of that particular thing that precedes us being distant from God and be intentional about addressing it, right? Or else the devil has a way of using that constantly to mess with your growth or your walk, even your fellowship with God. Constantly will bring it up some way, somehow. As soon as you are growing closer, you're drawing closer to him at a level that you don't normally, like you have not normally reached. All of a sudden, this one affliction will come. You will think about it and then you retrieve. As soon as you are growing in a certain spiritual level or authority, that affliction again will come and you retrieve. You have to take note of that so that you can intentionally address it and resolve it, right? And before we talk about even how to address it and resolve it, but if you look at an account in the book of Acts, I believe, wait, let me find it. So in Acts chapter 19, the verse 15 is my point of emphasis. But prior to that verse, there we have the sons of Sceva, and they were trying to cast out a demon from a man using the handkerchief of Paul. And they will say things like, we bind you, we cast you out by the Jesus that Paul preaches, right? And one day, one of the demons that was within the particular man that they were trying to cast out began to speak. And he said something that's very popular, which is, Jesus I know, Paul I know, but who are you, right? And if you study those two knows, like Jesus I know and Paul I know, you'll find out that they are two different words, right? In the original translation, but in English they both just mean know, but it's know in a different way. So the Paul I know part is very interesting because it's saying that Paul I am acquainted with. Paul I have sat down and I have observed for years. Like I know Paul as if he's a close acquaintance, as if he's a close family member. You know how we just know people, right? When you grow closer to somebody, you just know they don't even have to speak, but you just look at their face and you know how they are feeling, right? They don't even have to say a word, but you just look at how they're sitting, how their posture, and you could tell so many things by them not even speaking, like, right? And that's just the same way. That's the same knowing that this demon is talking about. Like Paul, I just know how he carries himself. Like I don't I don't even need to ask questions. Like I've observed it so much to just know him, right? And returning back to my original point, that there are things that often precedes us being distant from God. There's always a certain issue, one or two. It's not much. If you're honest, it's not much. That over time, as we are drawing closer to God, that thought will come in our mind. It will linger in our minds for a week. We will rebuke it. We will speak against it. We will speak faith and all these things. But then, after a while, we'll start to feel it in our hearts. And once we feel it in our hearts, that's where the problem is. And then we retreat from God. And then it comes again. It goes away after a while. We are fasting, we are praying, we are zealous. And then the thought, that affliction comes again, right? And it's almost as if the devil has been observing you. Like, as if they are just staring at you and they're like, this particular thing is what triggers her. This particular thing is what pulls her away from God. So, we're just going to let her worship and praise God and be all fervent for a week. And then we will come and put this affliction in her hearts to draw her back, right? Or this affliction or this thought is what makes her constantly fall into sin, into that same sin. So let us, allow her, give her the time to just be in the spirit and all that good things. And then after 3 weeks, we'll come back and drop this in her mind. And then she'll fall again. And then the thing is, once we draw away from God, or once we become angry with God, or once we even fall into a certain sin, it is hard for us to immediately come back to that level of intimacy that we were before, because now we are dealing with guilt, we are dealing with shame, we are dealing with disappointment. We feel as if God does not love us. Like, there's so many things that we have to go through. There's so many stumbling blocks that we literally have to go through in order to get back to that place of intimacy, just for us to lose it within another week, right? So it's a lot of emotional hustle if we don't take note of that particular affliction. So if I know I'm saying it a lot, but the one thing I really want you to leave with, if you notice that you constantly go through this cycle, this on and off relationship with God, take a second, become very observant about your thoughts, about your emotions, and take a second to think about the thoughts that you had prior to you being distant, the prominent thoughts, the prominent feeling. Was it a feeling of fear? Was it a feeling of anxiety? Like, think about these things that precede you distancing with God. So now I just want us to talk briefly about what to do once you have identified this particular trigger, right? The first thing is definitely to be honest before God. There is no intimacy without honesty. Just presenting it to Him like, this is exactly what I feel, right? And then allowing Him to give a response. And once He gives a response, you are then obliged to submit that feeling to that response, right? And so I'm honest with God. I'm telling Him, like, this is what I feel. These are the things that are associated with this particular feeling. And then this verse came to mind, and I began to just meditate on it, study it, look at other accounts and what other accounts had to say. And then you submit yourself. I think this is the hardest part, because oftentimes when we tell somebody, oh, pray about it, present it to God, we are like, oh, I did that. Or we share a certain Bible verse that addresses their issue. They are like, yeah, I read it, like, I've heard it. Okay, well then align with it. Like, it sounds a bit harsh, but like, we seriously just have to do what the word says, right? There's no like, oh, I've heard it before. Then what are you doing with that knowledge? Recently, one of my pastors, he said that knowledge that is not applied is not knowledge at all, right? You might as well have not known it if you don't apply it, right? So if you meditate and you reflect, and the response that God gives you, you have to submit your emotion to it. You have to submit you have to just submit to it. There's no other resolve than to submit to it, right? And to stand your ground on that, right? Anyway, I'm just gonna end here, right? Before I just start ranting, but let us just be mindful of these afflictions that are keeping us away from God. And let us write it down, take them one by one in prayer, in fellowship, even seeking counsel from a spiritual authority that you submit to. And yeah, making sure that you have a certain resolve for each and every one of it so that they no longer have a hold, or they no longer become a stumbling block between you and your fellowship with God. Because the only way we could grow in deep intimacy with God is through consistency. And we cannot be consistent if we keep ignoring these little triggers. Have a good day.